Well, folks, we're back for the final round of unnerf announcements. What could have been done in one video has instead been done in 4 due to the staggered reveals for these. This time around, it's all neutral cards, some actual big legendaries in here too, some crazy changes like Dragon Queen Albatross getting unnerfed here. Instead of your dragons costing 1, they're going to go back to costing 0. And that's an enormous change. Because the way it works right now with Dragon Queen Albatross, you play this on turn 9, you don't get any of the cheap dragons, right? You wait till turn 10, you're still only getting 1 cheap dragon. With the old Albatross, that's going to be the new Albatross moving forward, you get to play all the dragons on turn 9 if you want, making it a much bigger swing card potential, a turn or 2, frankly, earlier in the game. So you can swing harder and you can do it sooner, both of which clearly increase the power level here of Dragon Queen Albatross. Now, Albatross, if you look in wild format, I'm actually going to bust out some stats today. She's in 4.5% of wild decks already. I don't think she's a particularly super strong card in wild for Highlander decks, because, you know, there's other faster ones. Kazakus and Reno are doing their thing. Some of the class-specific ones are doing their thing a little bit earlier in the game and are probably more important to your game plan, but she's still getting played, and this makes her much, much stronger. So in those 4.5% of decks, she's going to be a way better card, and frankly, will probably pop into even more lists or encourage more Highlander play because she's going to be really, really strong at 9 mana for those reasons described. Also, of course, during our little mini meta where she's still going to be in rotation for that like 5 to 7 day window when this patch hits, but before we rotate, clearly she's going to make Highlander decks really good. Things like Highlander Hunter are also getting Bran back to its original cost. So Highlander Hunter in particular seems like it could be nuts in that mini meta. And then in the distant future, if she ever pops back into standard format as a part of the core set, maybe 2, 3 or more years down the line, clearly could be an amazing Highlander enabler again in the future. This is a very strong card when everything's going to be 0 mana off of that battle cry. Now, of note, they're not reverting the aspect where she can discover herself. That was more of a game-wide system change where cards can't discover or randomly generate themselves. So she won't be able to find herself still. So she won't be as strong as she was like day 1 for Dragon Queen Albatross, but will remain a very, very powerful card, I think. Next up here, we've got Archivist Aliciana going from 9 mana back to her original cost of 8 mana, otherwise staying the same. Now, we saw this nerf originally because it just was too good in things like Dr. Boom, Mad Genius, Control Warrior, I think was really one of the main reasons. There's probably another deck or two that were able to utilize her successfully. So slowing her down meant you couldn't hero power. It was harder to play other things with her. Just made her harder to squeeze into a turn safely, and that, you know, that had a nice impact on standard format. In wild format, the 9 mana cost, as I understand it, is actually somewhat beneficial here because people play the 9 mana Aliciana in Odd Warrior, again, to deny fatigue, to stretch out really long games, which they will not be able to do for Odd Warrior when she's moved to the even cost of 8 mana here. So some folks might consider this almost a nerf for wild format Aliciana. That's a fair argument, but it's, you know, a current or temporary argument. Clearly, there could be other decks in the future that are able to benefit from Aliciana at 8 mana, including even decks in the future, but also just any control deck that might need to deny fatigue in a, you know, long control grinding meta or something, or deck style could maybe better utilize this at 8 than 9. So overall, you know, a buff or nice nerf reversion here for Aliciana, but maybe a negative impact on wild players most immediately. Now, I don't think this is a big deal for the mini meta in the distant future. An 8 mana Aliciana remains a pretty interesting card. I think there will still be some future worlds where this is absolutely playable once again at 8 mana if she ever makes it back into the core set. Next up here, pretty interesting change. It's Undertaker getting unnerfed, going from the current 1 attack buff to a buff that is for both health and attack. And that's a big deal. Health scaling makes things like this much more snowbally in nature. just getting attack is sometimes strong. This version of Undertaker has not been good, but we've seen other, one drops that gain attack, Battle Fiend, Mana Worm that are really powerful in that regard. But it's when they get health too that things become really scary because they get harder and harder to kill over the course of a game, or maybe survive at least a few extra turns because they're scaling in health and kind of outpace removal options. And that's exactly what would happen with Undertaker of old when this was in the best deck in Hearthstone, and a deck that Blizzard has referenced as the strongest deck of all time. I don't know if that still remains true to this day, but there were eras of Hearthstone a year or two after this even where they were citing Undertaker Hunter as the best deck ever. And that's because often you'd have like 2, 4, 5 Undertakers on turn 3 or 4. They'd just be enormous. They'd have already hit your opponent for, 6+ damage or something by the time you get to turn 3 each. And they were still left on board as giant bodies, which just overwhelmed people. So this deck would completely steamroll. Took forever to get nerfed. So it was a big part of the meta for a really long time. Now, clearly, Naxxramas was like almost 7 years ago, I think, at this stage. So power levels back then don't necessarily hold up to power levels today. I don't know that this Undertaker is going to be that strong. And in fact, I'm pretty sure it won't be that strong in wild format because there's just so many crazy broken things these days. But I do think this is a card to keep an eye on. You get enough cheap death rattles in a system and you have a deck with enough just pressure. This might be an engine that supports that really, really well and gives you the payoff necessary for all your cheap death rattles. And, over time, we're going to get more and more and more cheap death rattles. So maybe it's not strong today, but in like a year or two, the right deck could line up. Enough death rattle stuff could happen. This is a card to keep an eye on. So do I think this will be good today? No, probably not. But it's an interesting one nonetheless. There is a door opened here for Undertaker that I don't think existed when it was only gaining attack. Next up, I love this change. Bad Luck Albatross going from 4 mana back to 3 mana. And that's awesome. I thought Albatross was a really fun card. I think it's the right kind of disruption. We have Ticketus nowadays. It's like destroying your opponent's stuff. That can feel pretty frustrating. I feel like Albatross disrupts. It gets in the way. It's annoying in the same sort of way as Ticketus. But it's kind of more playful and less destructive. And it feels like it's stalling them out instead of just completely denying their cards. Which for me is a much, much more fun way to screw with your opponent's stuff. So I hope we see more cards like Albatross. That said, the reason this got nerfed, it was just popping into like so many lists as a Highlander disrupt card, and just because it's kind of solid anyway, just for 3 mana, give your opponent a couple bad draws with a decent body. They wanted to push it to 4 to slow that down. It worked. It barely got any play at all at 4 mana. Going back to 3, I doubt this is something that makes a huge impact in Wild. Maybe it's there as a Highlander tech card at 3 mana again. But also, you could see some like shenanigan decks built around this for sure. I'm absolutely certain people will have a lot of fun with this card, and more fun at 3 mana than at 4. So even if it's not a huge meta impact, I think it's just a really great card at this cost. And same to be said for standard format now and later, mini meta and beyond. This is an interesting card to toss into decks and have some fun with, even if it's not defining the meta. It's a cool card at 3. I like it. Next up, this one shocked me. Arcane Golem getting unnerfed, going back to a 4/2 charge minion that gives your opponent a mana crystal. If you forgot this one, it's been a long time since this nerf hit, which is going to make it a very efficient, cheap damage output charge minion, which I thought Blizzard was trying to avoid. We saw Stone Tusk Boar and Bluegill Warrior changed. It feels like maybe that kind of 3 mana breakpoints, the magic spot where they're okay with charge existing in wild format, because you also had Wolf Rider at 3 that didn't get changed. Now Arcane Golem at 3. Even the card Charge for Warrior is now 3 mana. So clearly there's some kind of cost significance there. I don't know if that's to address a specific card coming out in the future or just more of a general, like, we don't want Charge to be too cheap. Could be both explanations, I'm sure. But this becomes another interesting card because you don't really care about giving your opponent a mana crystal if you're ending the game soon or immediately with the charge damage off of Arcane Golem here. So you could imagine this going into some fast decks as another way to reliably push face. And that means, could this be played? Yeah, maybe. I We've seen it in the past with cards like Power Overwhelming. I don't know if that specific combination's a thing, but it gives people options and flexibility to play a reasonably costed charge minion. There's still Leroy out there as well. This kind of fits a similar spot, but it's cheaper, so maybe better for combos in some scenarios. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if Arcane Golem actually managed to find its way into a competitive deck list, which I did not think I'd be saying anytime this year or in the next 20 years. Next up, here's our buddy Knife Juggler going from a 2/2 to a 3/2. And yeah, that's a totally reasonable unnerf here. I do not think it will make Knife Juggler OP. There was an era of Hearthstone where Knife Juggler was really good, and he was in a lot of decks because he was just kind of like one of the better 2-drops and had some clear upside for decks that could go wide in particular. That has not been the case these days. Even decks that do go wide and summon a lot of stuff, often there's just not quite enough payoff on Knife Juggler. I don't think adding an additional 1 attack changes that metric at all. I don't think he's kept up quite as well with mini cards these days in the power creep era of Hearthstone, where things seem to be getting stronger and stronger all the time. Knife Juggler kind of got left behind, so 3/2 doesn't make him impressive at all. Probably doesn't even make him particularly competitive. I mean, sure, there's shenanigans. There's a deck here or there that might use him, but he's not even being played in wideboard decks in Wild now. So I don't think this is a big enough change to change his fate. So moving over here to Leper Gnome, going from a 1/1 to a 2/1 for good buddy Leper Gnome. And this is going to sound contradictory, but I think this 1 attack change is more substantial than Knife Juggler's. I still don't think it's, world changing for Leper Gnome. I don't think he shoots to the top of the charts or anything, but just, on an attack per mana efficiency basis, it's a lot bigger to change 1 attack on a 1 mana card than a 2 mana card. Think about that. That's like, half of his total stats getting added onto him here. He goes from 2 total stats to 3 total stats. Also, the way this card operates, it's all about just getting in a little bit of damage and chipping in some damage. Every ounce of damage you can get. So when this occasionally gets to attack for 2 instead of 1, that could be a pretty significant breakpoint over the course of a game for a deck that's just looking to do as much damage as possible. That said, Leper Gnome, still probably not a super powerful card. There are some Death Rattle synergies and things, shenanigans possible with Leper Gnome, but the shenanigan-y style combo-y stuff probably didn't care about its attack as much. It's more the kind of like tempo playing on curve where the attack matters. So yeah, maybe he's back to enable Undertaker. I don't think there's anything magical there, but a slightly significant improvement here for Leper Gnome. Again, creates some possibilities, perhaps. Moving on over to Saronite Chain Gang here. Pretty subtle change, going back to summoning a copy instead of another Saronite Chain Gang. You may remember this was originally changed for Shutterwalk synergies, where it would allow you to create multiple Shutterwalks on board. Problems ensued. Change Saronite Chain Gang, that goes away. Now, that's not a huge change in Wild because there was already the card Doppelgangster that allowed you to do stuff in Wild. Plus, I don't think Shutterwalk's especially competitive in Wild. There's some meme stuff, some fringe stuff, but not, high-tier Shutterwalk decks. So this is probably totally fine for Wild, and it does open up another angle for this card, which is probably its original design intent and pretty awesome, which is like hand buff stuff becomes really cool. You buff your first Saronite Chain Gang and hand a bunch, then it's going to summon a copy of your buffed Saronite Chain Gang instead of just a 2/3 Chain Gang, which that's cool. That gives you a different angle and a different way to play this particular card. Again, I don't think that'll be super competitive. Hand buff's just really hard to keep up with everything else in the meta, but it's cool that this card is going back to its roots and probably doing what it was intended to do in a safe environment. And I think that also makes it kind of interesting, in the distant future, if it comes back for core sometime down the road, that could open up some really neat hand buff opportunities. I wouldn't mind seeing Saronite Chain Gang in a few years. So another one to keep an eye on. This is a really nice, good change, I think. Next up here, Bone Mare is going to go from 8 mana back to 7 mana. You might remember this in the kind of neutral tempo package back in the day. Kelliseth and crew, Bone Mare was sort of the finishing piece of that puzzle. You just tempo, and Bone Mare would often be the kind of finishing blow, damage output, or just so much stats on board that it was hard to deal with. And pushing it to 8 did help negate that problem a lot. Nowadays, I think a 7-mana Bone Mare is going to be totally fine. The game's a lot faster. There's more rush minions. There's more interactivity. It's harder to just get that kind of mid-range curve going and dominating off of that. So completely reasonable change. I think a Bone Mare at 7 is a fine, healthy card. There could be some really tiny impacts here, I guess, in like even and odd decks in Wild, but I don't think Bone Mare is being played at all in Wild from what I understand. Yeah, he's in 0% of decks. So I don't think this opens up a lot of avenues. Maybe in Arena or something, it could matter if this shows up, but otherwise, a totally fine change to bring him back to his normal spot. And then finally here, we got Frenzyfellwing going back to 3-3 from the current 3-2 status. And yeah, this was just to help make it easier to deal with a Fellwing if your opponent got one down early. There were some aggro decks that used it successfully. Frankly, Frenzyfellwing is not even really being played as a 3-2 in Wild or in Standard. He kind of got forgotten about. I don't even know if he would be particularly significant at 3-3 these days. Again, as more and more rush comes into the game and more interactivity with various removal spells and all these other things, the cards like this make less and less of an impact. So I don't think the health change here is significant enough to matter at all. I don't think this suddenly shoots into play. I think he remains an unplayed, mostly forgotten Hearthstone card despite the slight buff here. And yeah, I think that's it, guys. That's 10 unnerfed neutral cards. I gotta say, some of these were a little surprising, like the Arcane Golem. Some were completely reasonable and expected. Some I'm really excited about, like Bad Luck Albatross. I think Dragon Queen Albatross is going to have some potentially huge implications. If not in Wild immediately, certainly down the road if it ever comes back to core set. That's just a really cool card now with 0-mana dragons. Again, that said, I'm curious what you guys think. Were these good changes, bad changes? There were definitely some cards that were up for unnerfing that we thought might happen that didn't. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on those as well. We talked about that on stream a bit. Share your thoughts on cards you thought might be unnerfed or you wished were. Looking forward to seeing all those comments down below. But until then, thanks much as always for watching. And until next time, game on.